In section number 4, we're going to learn how to define environment variables for containers. As you can see in this example, it's very simple to define environment variables for containers. All you have to do is to define env, and then underneath that, you define each one of the environment variables as well as their values. But let's suppose you want to deploy containers to 3 environments, dev, staging, and production. And one of the environment variables was the URL of the database. Now, naturally, you're probably going to have a database per environment, and so the URLs are going to be different for each one of the environments. If you hard-coded the value of that URL in the configuration file, that means you would have to have one configuration file per environment, and that's not what you want. What you want is to have a single configuration file that you can use across different environments. And to achieve that, you need to decouple the value of the environment variables from the pod or from the deployment configuration file. And one of the ways we can do that is with something called ConfigMaps. So basically, ConfigMaps is a resource that stores non-confidential data in key value pairs. Now, there's another way that you can decouple environment variable values from deployment configuration files, and that's with something called secrets. Now, what's the difference between secrets and ConfigMaps? So as I said, ConfigMaps is using for non-confidential information. Now, secrets, on the other hand, and as the name suggests, that's used for managing sensitive information, such as passwords, tokens, or even SSH keys. So basically what we're going to be doing now is for each one of the microservices, we need to define a couple of environment variables, and we're going to define which ones are sensitive information and which ones are not. And this means that for some of the microservices, we're going to have ConfigMaps and secrets. So let's see how that's going to work. Starting with front end, I'm going to create a file called configmap.yaml. And the definition of a config map is very simple. The API version is v1. And note that this is different than deployments. Deployments was apps v1. Here is just v1. Then the kind is config map. We also have a metadata, and we're going to define the name of the config map, which is going to be front end. Then instead of spec, we're going to have data. So what's going to be the data of my config map? So the front end needs 3 things as environment variables: the Auth Api address, the port on which the front end is going to be listening to traffic, and also the address of the TODO's API. So I'm going to define 3 key value pairs. The first one is Auth Api address. And the value of this environment variable is going to be this. And don't worry about this weird DNS name. We're going to be talking about that when we get to services. Then the next one is called port. And here you just need to be careful that when you specify a number, you need to put quotes around that. So this is for config maps. When you define config maps, put quotes around the number. Then the last one is the TODO's API address. And that's going to be this one. And there you go. That's the config map for the front end. Only 8 lines of code. So let me quickly deploy that. So kubectl apply for an NK8's config. And the reason I got that is because I forgot the namespace. So let's make sure we specify the namespace. Let's give it another go. All right, so it was created. Now I can do get. I can either say config map or short CM. Namespace team1. And we have our front end there. Now, one thing to understand here is that this is not the environment variables for my front end. This is basically 3 key value pairs. If I want my front end to have these environment variables and these values, I need to declare 3 environment variables in my deployment.yaml. So let's do that next. So deployment.yaml, right here at the bottom after ports, I'm going to define env. Env is also an array. So the first item, I define the name of my environment variable. And the name of my environment variable really depends on what my application is expecting. In this case, the front end is expecting auth _API _address. Now, if I wanted to set up the value directly, I could do that, but the value is actually going to come from the config map. So value from, then the next thing is something called config map key ref. I'll explain what that means. And so we're going to have the name and then the key, which is going to be the same as this. So what does this mean? So basically I'm saying that the value of my environment variable Auth API address will come from a config map, which is named front end. So that's the name of the config map. And then the key inside that file or inside that config map is called Auth API address. And it's this one right here. Now I named this environment variable and this key in the config map exactly the same just to make my life easier. But in theory, you could name anything within the config map as long as you refer to it here. But the name of the environment variable, then this one needs to be whatever your application is expecting. Now, because I have 3 of them, I'm just going to copy and create 2 more. The second one is going to be the port, which will also come from the front end. And the key is called port. Then the last one is the TODO API address. Okay, so now let's redeploy the front end. Actually, before I redeploy, I just wanted to show you one thing. So if you get the pods in namespace team1 in my case, I'm going to get the name of the front end pod and I'm going to describe it. One thing you notice is that here at the top, we have the front end and we have a lot of information about container ID, the image, port, and a bunch of other things, but we don't have any environment variable. Let's redeploy and see how this is going to look like. So kubectl apply, and you can see that apply can be used for the first time you deploy things and also when you update. So front end K8 deployment. And it says configured. When it says configured, that means something changed. If I get the pods again, this front end is terminating, which was the previous one. And the new one, which was launched in this case 8 seconds ago, is already running. So if I get that and then I describe it, we'll see something different. So now we see environment and we see 3 environment variables. That's one way to double check environment variables have been set. Another way to double check is to go inside the pod and check if the environment variables are there. So kubectl exec -it namespace team1. So I want to just bring up the shell. So now I'm inside the front end container. And if I do env, I should be able to see TODO's API or Auth API, TODO's API, and also port. So I can see the 3 environment variables that I defined, they're here. And of course, you're going to see a lot more environment variables because these are defined by default. So when you launch your containers, Kubernetes create these other environment variables for you. Next is the Auth API, and this is how the config map is going to look like. The Auth API requires the Auth API port, which is going to be where the process is going to be listening for traffic on, and also the user's API address. Now there is one more environment variable which the Auth API will require, which is something called Jwt Secret. Now this Jwt Secret is a token, and because it is a token, we're not going to use the config map for that. When we're talking about passwords, tokens, keys, etc., we should use a secret. So let me create another file called secret.yaml. And same way, the definition of a secret is very simple. API version is also v1. The kind is secret. The metadata, I'm going to give it a name called Auth API. And let's not forget the namespace. Then there is something different, which is the type. So let's take a look at the type of secret. So these are the type of secrets. We have opaque, which is arbitrary user-defined data. Then you have a few other things like service account tokens, Docker configuration files, Docker configuration, credentials for basic authentication, SSH authentication, data for TLS client or server, or Bootstrap token data. So these are the types of secrets, and the one that we want is opaque, because we're going to be defining arbitrary user-defined data. So I'm gonna copy opaque, come back here. So type is going to be opaque, and now we also have data. The key is going to be Jwt Secret. The value is going to be a little bit different. Coming back to the documentation, we can see this caution saying that Kubernetes secrets are by default stored as unencrypted base64 encoded strings, which means that when you define a secret, you actually need to convert that. You need to encode using base64. And I guess you might be thinking, well, if this is called a secret, why is it stored unencrypted? And yeah, in the beginning it was like that. Kubernetes secrets were unencrypted, but later on they added support for encryption, and it even says here that in order to safely use secrets, it's recommended that you enable encryption at rest and also enable or configure RBAC rules, but most importantly, enable encryption at rest. Coming back to our file, this should be the value of Jwt Secret, but like I said, we're going to have to encode it using base64. Going to my terminal, I'm just going to do echo, and then -n to remove the new line at the end, because I don't want new line to be part of the resulting base64 encoded string. And then pipe base64. That's going to return this, and this is exactly what I need there for my secret. So instead of my fancy secret, it's going to be the base64 encoded version. And there you go. So that's the secret for the Auth API, and this is the config map for the Auth API. And before we deploy both of them, we just need to do the same thing we did for the front end, but here in the Auth API. So we just need to declare the environment variables. To save us some time, this is going to be the environment variables. So Auth API is going to be a config map. User's API address is also going to be a config map, but then Jwt Secret is going to be a secret. So that's the only thing that changes between the secret and the config map. The rest is pretty much the same. All right, so let's deploy all of these resources. Now I could run kubectl for each one of them, but one of the things you can do is you can do kubectl apply and then -R for recursive, -F, and then Auth API, K8, and that's it. And what this is going to do is it's going to take all of the files inside the K8 folder and deploy all of them. So let's see that in action. Great, so we can see the config map was created, the secret was created, but the deployment was configured. So that means something changed. Let's get our pods again. Get pods, team 1. We can see the Auth API has been deployed already. And if I describe the pod, we can see the 3 environment variables were set. And a difference here is that you have Auth API of config map, users API also of config map, but then Jwt Secret in secret. So we have 2 config maps and 1 secret. Next is TODO's API, and this is going to be the config map for TODO's API. We can see that we have these 4 key value pairs. So the TODO API port, and then some configuration for Redis. And this is going to be the secret, which is essentially the same as the one we did for Auth API. Then lastly, let's define environment variables in the deployment.yaml. So we're going to have 5 environment variables in total, 4 coming from a config map and 1 coming from a secret. Then deploying, recursive, TODOs. This is the config map for the users API, and this is the secret. And this is the environment variables declaration. Last but not least, log message processor. The log message processor doesn't need any sensitive information. So that's why we're just going to use a config map. And these will be the environment variables. Okay, so let's just get the pods again, make sure everything is still running. Apart from log message processor, we're expecting it to error at this point still, but we're gonna fix it very soon. But most importantly is that the rest is still running. Awesome, and that is section number 4. In section number 5, we're gonna be deploying Redis.